I am here to introduce Andy Burden, who's going to be speaking to you today about the Texas Antiquities Code. And Andy has about 25 years of experience as an archaeologist and principal investigator. She has been with ICF for 10 years, and she is an Aggie.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Velma for giving me that great introduction. And thank you to the Nueces River Authority, especially to Travis, for organizing this event and inviting me to come and speak to all of you. It's truly a privilege and an honor, especially that you guys are really, really the stewards of what is considered our major natural resource, the water. In the work that a lot of you do, you also end up stewarding some other resources that are important to our populations, not just endangered species like natural resources, but also cultural resources. And that's kind of one of the things that is going to lie at the heart of what I talk about today. I'm a professional archaeologist. Like Velma said, I've been in this business for over 25 years, leading projects, water in particular, to its fruition, to supply all the needs of our population here in Texas. And it's been a great privilege throughout my career. So I'll just get to it. We're missing the text on the slides. Oh, there's some. Okay. Well, we may be missing this first slide, but I'll just walk you through some of the items that I'll be talking about today. The first of which is, what are cultural resources? It sounds like a really weird term. What cultural resources regulations apply to waters projects in particular? What efforts might be required in advance of construction? And what to do if you have something like an inadvertent discovery, and what does that mean? So cultural resources, when we talk about that, there's sort of a squishy definition of that term, and it's a term that collectively refers to the tangible and intangible elements that reflect a people's shared history and identity. That's kind of like nailing Jell-O to a wall. How do you define what that actually means? So in practicality, we're talking about really resources that are 45 years or older. Think of things like buildings or bridges or dams, irrigation canals that are really old, archaeological sites, shipwrecks, some of the more popular ones, cemeteries, sacred and religious landmarks, landscapes, objects like monumental sculptures. There's a cenotaph in the city of San Antonio that people may be talking about these days. That's a cultural resource. Also roadside markers to some degree. There we go. Oh, that's not mine. Okay, back to my presentation. So what cultural resources regulations might apply to waters projects? Now, I know we're going to be talking more about the Texas Antiquities Code, but one of the things I do want to make sure that I get in there is sort of a nod to the federal regulations that sort of govern a lot of the work that I do for cultural resources management. And that would be the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 and Section 110. Those would apply to projects that are carried out by a federal agency. Most of y'all won't deal with that. May take place on federal or tribal land. That's a rarity in the state of Texas, but requires a federal permit, license, or approval. That you might come across, and receives federal funds. I know that's pretty common. Some sneaky Section 106 triggers, meaning the ones that people don't often think about, would be the funding related to state revolving funds, permits through the Clean Water Act or the Rivers and Harbors Act, often involving the Corps of Engineers and their jurisdiction. Okay, now I get down to the Antiquities Code. This is a really fun one because the Antiquities Code in Texas actually predates the National Historic Preservation Act. You know, like we do in so many ways, Texans led the way in the nation when it comes to sort of preserving and protecting our national cultural identity. And the Antiquities Code is no exception. It's one of the most common cultural resources management triggers for compliance for the state of Texas water projects. It has essentially the same purpose as Section 106. It's meant to prevent cultural resources that are considered important or significant from a historical or cultural context from being destroyed during infrastructure development without first being mitigated, meaning like the information they contain being salvaged in some way. So the Antiquities Code applies to projects that take place on lands owned or controlled by a political subdivision of the state. And I've heard that term. A lot of people have been referring to a political subdivision a lot today. So that's another one that applies to the Antiquities Code. There are also some sneaky Antiquities Code triggers, ones that people don't often think about, like school districts, municipal utility districts, and state-funded universities, also Texas A&M being a land-grant college, as well as UT. It would apply to projects that they undertake. Easements and rights-of-way are also considered part of the code because it's not only applies to political subdivisions of the state, it applies to what is called public lands, which are defined as lands owned, but also those controlled by political subdivisions of the state. There are categorical exclusions under the Antiquities Code. There's a thing called the notification clause of the Antiquities Code, which is basically the threshold for whether a project needs to be coordinated with the Texas Historical Commission under the Antiquities Code. And that's generally projects that have some sort of ground disturbance, anything that's larger than 5 acres or is going to impact more than 5,000 cubic yards of dirt. Does the project take place within a designated historic district, for the buildings that might be affected? Are there other historic sites that might be affected by the project? And is the project likely to impact a recorded archaeological site? Although these are less common than that triggered by the Antiquities Code, there are a couple of other cultural resources regulations I'd just like to put a nod to for you. One is the Health and Safety Code of Texas, Section 711, and that deals with cemeteries. And a lot of times when we're building a lot of these infrastructures in rural areas, you may come across abandoned cemeteries. It's becoming more and more common as time goes on. And Texas passed amendments to their Health and Safety Code in 2009 that sort of put into words the text about abandoned or what they call unknown cemeteries. Those that you are likely to come across that have no cemetery association, they're not maintained, they may have been overgrown, unknown, unmanaged for a number of years, maybe for decades at a time. And they're discovered as a result of the impetus, the development of infrastructure projects. That particular code, or Section 711, deals with the impacts to human burials. I should point out, both prehistoric and historic era burials. The code makes no distinction about whether a cemetery is 100 years old or 10,000 years old. So it applies to both prehistoric as well as historic era burials, and it's both on public and private land. One of the other less common, although it does happen, are city historic preservation ordinances. The most common one that I deal with is the City of San Antonio's Historic Preservation Ordinance. Those take place within the city limits or the ETJ where such ordinances exist. I think the City of Seguin actually has a historic preservation ordinance, but it deals with historic districts, standing structures, not archaeology. Also a very important one to remember. So what's required in advance of construction? This is oftentimes where people say, what does it mean when the rubber hits the road? So this basic list is in order of increasing level of effort, I guess you could say. So for project planning, one of the things that I often do for my clients is constraints mapping. Are there any known archaeological sites or significant historic structures in the path of a water pipeline or a new treatment plant or a reservoir? Also, there's alternatives analysis, things like feasibility studies. Is there a way to route around this? What will be a better route to go? Archaeological probability modeling. We use that a lot more these days, is becoming far more advanced to determine where you are likely to find as yet unidentified archaeological sites. And to be frank, you got to know where the archaeological sites are in your path in order to evaluate whether each site is significant or not. And one of the questions I often get asked is, just because I found an archaeological site, is that going to delay my project? And the answer is no. Actually, few archaeological sites, we document tens of thousands of archaeological sites around Texas in any given year. And very few of those turn out to be eligible for the National Register, meaning they meet a series of criteria that are determined to be significant. And so just because you happen to have an archaeological site within your path doesn't necessarily mean that it's anything to be concerned about. It's certainly not a deal breaker to derail or delay your project. Also, we can do urban, rural, and historic landscape analysis. That's often contextual. That often helps with historic districts as well. Agency coordination, one of the barest bones types of coordination I do with the THC, the Texas Historical Commission, is to generate a letter. It's just a desktop review letter from my client, my water district, or my river authority, and say, hey, this is the project that we're going to be progressing. These are the constraints in the area, and we want to know whether a survey is required or not required. And we're making a recommendation. We'd like your concurrence on that. That's sort of the basic level. Oh, one of the things I wanted to point out, one of the coolest pictures I've got on this slide is up at the top. The top photo at the top slide is a canal intersection check gate for the Wichita County Water Improvement District number 1. And it was constructed in 1923, 1924, is considered a cultural resource. So beyond the desktop reviews, when you actually need an archaeological survey or another type of cultural resources survey, the things that we look for are historic resources, those things that are the built environment, like that check gate, or historic building, a historic school, any type of above ground infrastructure, archaeological sites, as well as cemeteries. Now, to run you through what a survey for cultural resources looks like, if your project triggers compliance with the Antiquities Code, a permit from the THC is required before we, the consultants, could go and conduct a survey for cultural resources, as well as other forms of investigation. So there are permitting requirements involved. At the end of the survey, it would allow us to identify resources and, in most cases, gather sufficient information to evaluate the significance of those things based on established criteria, particularly that for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, or in Texas, they call those state antiquities landmarks. And in some cases, there may be more data needed to make that evaluation. By and large, I'd say 80 to 90% of those recommendations are done at the survey level phase. But if you come across something that might require a closer look, you could go to National Register testing. That's the second phase. It's just a closer look at a particular resource, gather a little bit more information, maybe a little bit more documentation to present to the Texas Historical Commission to support a recommendation of eligibility. If project impacts to a significant cultural resource cannot be avoided, then the last course of action is mitigation of those effects. And that can be conducted in a number of ways. The first one you'll see on the screen is archaeological data recovery. Data recovery is just a fancy word to say dig. It's an excavation, an organized excavation. It's meant to salvage data from an archaeological site that is going to be lost as a result of its destruction. Second one is what's called HABS here, or HALS documentation. The quick way to say that is HABS is the Historic American Buildings Survey, and it's basically designed to document, to map out, to draw all of the documentation for a historic building. The third one is a National Register nomination. We actually do that sometimes for districts. You could do that for groups of sites, and you can fill that out. That gets submitted to your state historic preservation officer for review, and then they determine whether a National Register nomination is to be granted. At times, survey can be substituted with construction monitoring based on the needs of the project and coordination with the regulatory authority. That happens sometimes. It depends on the project. It's not that common, but it can happen. It's happening a lot in San Antonio, just based on the project needs and the fact that it's a really urban environment. And the last one, cemetery relocations. It sounds weird. How can you relocate a cemetery, right? But it can be done. Undertakers and funeral directors have been doing that for hundreds of years. Archaeologists now undertake that as a regular course of action for cemeteries that are over 100 years old, particularly those that are abandoned or unknown, and there's a legal process involved for that. They can be conducted according to regulatory processes that require disinterment permits. Again, you got to have a permit to complete. So what do you do if you have an inadvertent discovery? An inadvertent discovery is your construction manager is calling you up saying, we found something. Nobody wants to have that call, right? But they may have found something. In particular, this happens a lot when you find human remains that are within your right-of-way or your project site. Now, generally, a project by that point will have what they call an inadvertent discovery plan for cultural resources. If you don't, and it's not part of your environmental review, there's a quick way to generate your own. Inadvertent discovery plans should be drafted and filed prior to construction. Is just sort of an insurance plan for your own safety, well, to guide what could happen, in the event that that happens. And typical plan stipulations include ceasing ground disturbance in the immediate vicinity of the find, protecting the find from further disturbance, securing the location from unauthorized access, and notifying the appropriate state agencies like the Texas Historical Commission, and consulting on next steps. You might be able to avoid the find, might be able to evaluate the find, and there may be other things that may be required. In the case of burials, human remains, I often recommend to my clients, call your county sheriff if you happen to have that happen. They will need the assistance of your coroner, your county coroner. If your county does not have a county coroner, your justice of the peace will do in a pinch. So that's all I have as far as what the statutory regulations are for cultural resources. When it comes to the Texas Antiquities Code, we've had a lot of practice at that. It's been around since the 1960s. It's undergone some amendments, not that many. In particular, the latest amendments really just deal with those 2009 changes to the Health and Safety Code and sort of aligning with unknown and abandoned cemeteries and what's required under those conditions. The Texas Antiquities Code also has a number of memorandum of understandings with different state agencies. I believe the Texas Water Development Board used to have a memorandum of understanding with the Texas Historical Commission, which was enshrined as part of the code. I think that expired in 2018, but essentially what's in there is a lot of the same stuff that you've heard today, especially the part about inadvertent discoveries as a guidebook. And that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to take them.
I do not have any questions that have come through yet. So if anybody has a question, please put it on or raise your hand. I just have one question. General is, what is the timeline usually to obtain those permits and do a historical study?
So when a project is determined that they need a survey, an archaeological or another type of cultural resources survey, the timeline for submission to the Texas Historical Commission is they have a 30-day review period, which is enshrined in the Antiquities Code. They generally take less than 30 days, and that's been my experience over the past 20 years.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Travis.